The whispers came at midnight, soft and broken, drifting through the marble corridors of the Seo estate like a prayer carried on desperate wind. Dae-hyun Seo, one of Los Angeles' most feared Korean Mafia bosses, froze outside his son's bedroom door, his hand trembling on the doorframe as he witnessed something that would shatter every wall he'd built around his heart. Inside, Naomi Carter knelt beside 8-year-old Jisoo's bed, her dark hands gently cradling his small ones, tears streaming down her face as she whispered to God about a boy who wasn't hers, but whom she loved as if he were. The child, who hadn't slept peacefully in months, who flinched at shadows and spoke only in whispers, lay calm and trusting, his breathing soft and even for the first time since masked intruders had tried to break into their home. "Please help him feel safe," Naomi's voice broke with raw sincerity. "Let him know he is protected, he is loved, he is strong." Dae-hyun's breath punched out of him as he watched this black woman, hired as a maid, treated as help, pour her soul into healing his son in ways his money, power, and desperation never could. The most dangerous man in the city found himself breaking down in a doorway, realizing that love had walked into his house disguised as service, and salvation had arrived in the form of a woman whose gentle heart could reach places his empire couldn't touch. Welcome to Korean Mafia lovers. Hey there. Please drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Your support is essential for us to continue bringing you these incredible stories. The Seo estate stood like a fortress against the Los Angeles skyline, its towering walls and sophisticated security systems designed to keep the world out and its secrets in. Inside the mansion's pristine halls, where priceless art hung beneath crystal chandeliers and marble floors reflected the cold gleam of wealth, silence reigned with an oppressive weight that made even the staff speak in hushed tones. Dae-hyun Seo moved through his domain with the fluid grace of a predator, his tailored black suit impeccable despite the late hour. At 32, he commanded respect through reputation alone, his name whispered in both fear and reverence throughout the Korean underground of Southern California. Every step he took echoed with authority, every glance carried the weight of unspoken threats, and every decision he made rippled through an empire built on loyalty, blood, and the kind of power that money couldn't buy. But tonight, as he climbed the grand staircase toward his son's wing of the house, Dae-hyun felt the familiar knot of helplessness tighten in his chest. All his power, all his influence, all his carefully constructed control meant nothing when faced with the one battle he couldn't win, healing his son's broken spirit. Jisoo had once been the light of the mansion, a bright 8-year-old whose laughter could fill entire rooms and whose curiosity made him ask endless questions about everything from the stars to the strange men who visited his father's office. He had been fearless, climbing trees in their private garden, racing through hallways with toy cars, and falling asleep each night with stories of adventures dancing in his head. That was before the night 3 months ago when masked intruders had attempted to breach their home security. Though his men had neutralized the threat before any real harm could come to his family, the psychological damage to Jisoo had been devastating and seemingly irreversible. The boy who had once run freely through their home now flinched at sudden movements, spoke only in whispers, and spent most nights curled in corners, tracing invisible patterns with trembling fingers. Dae-hyun paused outside his son's bedroom, listening to the familiar sounds of restless sleep, small whimpers, the rustle of sheets as Jisoo tossed and turned, the occasional sharp intake of breath that suggested another nightmare was taking hold. He pressed his forehead against the cool wood of the door, feeling the weight of his failures settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He had hired the best child psychologists money could buy. Dr. Leila Romero came highly recommended, with degrees from prestigious universities and a reputation for working with traumatized children. She visited twice a week, armed with techniques and theories that sounded promising in her gentle voice, but seemed to bounce off Jisoo's protective shell like raindrops on glass. The security had been tripled. Sang-min Ri, his most trusted enforcer, had personally vetted every guard, every camera, every sensor that protected the estate. The house was now more secure than some government facilities, with enough firepower and surveillance to stop a small army. Yet none of it could chase away the shadows that lived in his son's mind. Private tutors had replaced school to eliminate any potential triggers in a public environment. The best educators in the city came to teach Jisoo in the safety of his own home, bringing carefully selected materials and gentle approaches designed to rebuild his confidence. But the boy who had once devoured books and asked endless questions now sat silent through lessons, his dark eyes distant and unfocused. Even the mansion's staff had been carefully chosen for their discretion and gentleness. Mrs. Yoonji Park, the head housekeeper, had been with the family for years and treated Jisoo with the tender care of a grandmother. The other staff members moved like ghosts through the house, completing their duties with minimal noise and maximum efficiency, all of them aware that the young master needed peace above all else. But peace, Dae-hyun had learned, was not the same as healing. The sound of his son's distressed whimper through the door made his hands clench into fists. He had built an empire through decisive action, had solved every problem with strategic thinking and overwhelming force. Yet here he stood, powerless against the invisible wounds that no amount of money or influence could touch. A soft footstep on the marble floor behind him made him turn. Naomi Carter approached with the quiet grace that had become her signature since joining their household staff 2 weeks ago. She carried a small tray with warm milk and honey, something she had suggested might help Jisoo sleep better, and her presence seemed to bring a subtle warmth to the cold hallway. At 29, Naomi possessed a natural beauty that needed no enhancement, her rich dark skin glowing with health, and her expressive brown eyes holding depths of compassion that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. She wore her hair in neat professional styles that framed her face perfectly, and her modest clothing, always appropriate for her position, couldn't hide the graceful way she moved through the world. "Mr. Seo," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle accent of her Georgia roots. "I thought Jisoo might like some warm milk before bed. Sometimes it helps children settle." Dae-hyun studied her face, noting the genuine concern that creased her brow. In the short time she had been with them, Naomi had shown more intuitive understanding of his son's needs than most of the expensive professionals he had hired. She seemed to possess an innate gentleness that made even the most skittish creatures trust her. He had watched her coax birds from trees and calm their temperamental guard dogs with nothing more than patient kindness. "He's having another difficult night," Dae-hyun admitted, his voice rougher than usual. It was more than he typically shared with staff, but something about Naomi's presence made honesty feel safer than his usual walls of control. "Would you like me to sit with him for a while?" she offered, her tone carefully respectful, but warm with genuine care. Sometimes children find it easier to settle when they're not alone with their thoughts. The offer hung in the air between them, and Dae-hyun found himself considering it seriously. Every instinct he possessed as a father wanted to be the one to comfort his son, to be the source of safety and peace that Jisoo needed. But every attempt he had made seemed to fall short, his presence somehow carrying too much weight, too much intensity for a child who needed gentleness above all else. "He doesn't usually respond well to," Dae-hyun began, then stopped himself. He had been about to say strangers, but Naomi wasn't exactly a stranger anymore. In just 2 weeks she had become a quiet, steady presence in their home, moving through her duties with an efficiency that impressed Mrs. Park and a kindness that had caught the attention of everyone who worked there. "I understand if you'd prefer to handle it yourself," Naomi said quickly, misreading his hesitation. "I just thought sometimes a different voice, a different energy might help." Before Dae-hyun could respond, another small whimper came from behind Jisoo's door, followed by the sound of sheets rustling as the boy shifted restlessly. The sound cut through him like a blade, and he made a decision that surprised even himself. "Try," he said simply, stepping aside to give her access to the door. "If he seems uncomfortable with your presence, I'll take over." Naomi nodded, her expression serious with the weight of the trust he was placing in her. She knocked softly on the door, 3 gentle taps that wouldn't startle, and waited for permission before entering. "Jisoo," she called softly. "It's Miss Naomi. I brought you some warm milk with honey. May I come in?" The rustling stopped, followed by a long moment of silence. Then, barely audible, came Jisoo's whispered response. "Okay." Daehyun watched from the doorway as Naomi entered his son's room with careful, deliberate movements. She left the door open, a gesture he appreciated, as it showed she understood the importance of transparency when it came to his child, and approached the bed with the same gentle patience she brought to everything she did. Jisoo was curled on his side, his dark hair tousled from restless sleep, and his small hands clutched around a stuffed tiger that had been his constant companion since the incident. His eyes were wide and alert, tracking Naomi's movements with the hypervigilance that had become his default state, but there was no fear in his expression, only curiosity. "I thought you might like something warm to help you sleep," Naomi said, setting the tray on his bedside table and settling into the chair that Dr. Romero used during their sessions. She didn't reach for him or invade his space, instead folding her hands in her lap and offering him a gentle smile. "It smells good," Jisoo whispered, his voice so soft that Daehyun had to strain to hear it from the doorway. "My grandmother used to make it for me when I was your age," Naomi replied, her tone conversational but soothing. "She said the honey helped chase away bad dreams and the warm milk helped your body remember how to rest." Something flickered in Jisoo's eyes. Interest, perhaps, or the faint echo of the curiosity that had once defined him. "Did it work?" "Most of the time," Naomi said honestly. "Sometimes our minds need a little extra help to find peace, especially when we've been scared or worried about something." Daehyun felt his breath catch as he watched his son actually engage in conversation, brief though it was, for the first time in weeks. There was something about Naomi's presence that seemed to create a bubble of safety around her, a space where even the most frightened creatures could begin to breathe again. As Jisoo slowly sat up to accept the warm milk, Daehyun found himself studying the woman who had somehow accomplished in minutes what teams of professionals had failed to achieve in months. There was something almost magical about the way she moved through the world, bringing light to dark places without even seeming to try. And for the first time since the night that had changed everything, Daehyun allowed himself to hope that perhaps healing was possible after all. Over the following days, Daehyun found himself observing Naomi with the same strategic attention he applied to business negotiations and territorial disputes. But instead of looking for weaknesses or angles to exploit, he was trying to understand the source of her seemingly effortless ability to reach his son. It wasn't magic, he realized as he watched her work. It was something far more rare and valuable, genuine compassion paired with infinite patience. Naomi approached Jisoo the way a skilled gardener might tend to a delicate seedling that had been damaged by harsh weather. She never pushed, never demanded responses or reactions, never showed frustration when progress seemed slow or non-existent. Instead, she simply made herself available, creating a consistent presence that radiated safety and acceptance. She had taken to spending a few minutes in Jisoo's room each evening after completing her regular duties, not as part of any formal arrangement, but because she seemed to genuinely enjoy the boy's quiet company. Sometimes she would read to him from books she had carefully selected, stories of gentle adventures and brave children who overcame their fears through kindness rather than force. Other times, she would sit by his window and fold origami animals from colorful paper she had purchased with her own money, her hands moving with practiced grace as she created cranes and butterflies and tiny dragons. Jisoo watched these activities with growing fascination, his hypervigilant posture gradually relaxing as he became accustomed to Naomi's peaceful energy. She never insisted that he participate, never made him feel guilty for his silence or his fears. She simply existed in his space like a warm, steady light, chasing away shadows without drawing attention to the darkness they had displaced. "Miss Naomi," Jisoo whispered one evening as she finished folding a delicate paper crane. How do you make them so perfect? It was the first question he had asked anyone in weeks, and Dae-hyun, who had been passing by the open door, stopped to listen from the hallway. Practice, Naomi replied with a gentle smile, offering the crane to Jisoo to examine, and patience with myself when they don't turn out right the first time. My grandmother taught me that beautiful things take time to create, and that every mistake is just a step toward getting it right. Jisoo turned the paper crane over in his small hands, studying the precise folds and delicate proportions with the focused attention he had once brought to his favorite books. Could you teach me? I would love to, Naomi said, and Dae-hyun could hear the genuine joy in her voice. We can start with something simple, like a butterfly. Would you like that? The sight of his son nodding eagerly, the first enthusiastic response Jisoo had shown to anything in months, made Dae-hyun's chest tighten with emotions he couldn't name. He watched as Naomi patiently guided Jisoo through the basic folds, her hands covering his smaller ones when he needed help, her voice soft and encouraging as she praised each small success. You're a natural, she told him, as his first wobbly butterfly took shape. Look how carefully you're making each fold. That's the secret, not speed, but attention to what you're creating. Jisoo held up his creation with something that almost resembled pride, and for a moment, Dae-hyun glimpsed the confident, curious child his son had been before fear had stolen his light. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable, and it filled him with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. Later that evening, after Naomi had helped Jisoo settle for the night and returned to her own quarters, Dae-hyun found himself standing in his study, staring out at the city lights while trying to process the changes he was witnessing in his home. The mansion felt different somehow, warmer, more alive, as if Naomi's presence had awakened something that had been sleeping in its walls. Mrs. Park knocked softly on his door, entering with the tea service she brought him each night. The elderly housekeeper had been with the SEO family for over a decade, and her loyalty was absolute. But Dae-hyun had noticed a subtle shift in her demeanor since Naomi's arrival. The new girl is good with the young master, Mrs. Park said without preamble, setting the tea tray on his desk with practiced efficiency. It was as close to a personal opinion as she ever offered, and coming from her, it carried significant weight. Yes, Dae-hyun agreed, accepting the cup she poured for him. She seems to understand him in ways that others haven't. She has a gentle heart, Mrs. Park continued, her tone thoughtful, and she works hard without complaint. The other staff like her. She helps where she can, never acts above her station, but treats everyone with respect. Dae-hyun nodded, filing away this information. In a household like his, where discretion was paramount and loyalty was essential, the approval of existing staff was crucial, but more than that, he was beginning to understand that Naomi's impact extended beyond just his son. She seemed to bring out the best in everyone around her, creating ripples of positivity that spread throughout their carefully controlled environment. Has she mentioned anything about her background? He asked, realizing that despite her growing importance to his family, he knew very little about Naomi's life outside their walls. Only that she has family in Georgia, Mrs. Park replied. She sends money home each month. I've seen her at the post office when I run errands. She's careful with her earnings, saves what she can, but she's generous when others need help. This information painted a picture of someone who understood responsibility and sacrifice, qualities that Dae-hyun respected deeply. It also suggested that Naomi's position in his household was more than just a job to her. It was a lifeline that supported people she cared about. The next morning brought an unexpected test of the fragile progress Jisoo had been making. Dr. Romero arrived for their regular session, her professional smile and gentle manner unchanged from previous visits. But something about the formal nature of therapy seemed to trigger Jisoo's anxiety in ways that Naomi's informal presence did not. Dae-hyun watched from his office as his son retreated into himself, his responses becoming monosyllabic, his body language closing off as Dr. Romero attempted to engage him with carefully designed exercises and questions. The contrast with his behavior around Naomi was stark and troubling. Jisoo seems to be experiencing some resistance today, Dr. Romero explained to Daehyun after the session ended with minimal progress. It's not uncommon for children with trauma to have good days and difficult days. We just need to be patient and consistent. But as Daehyun walked the therapist to her car, he found himself questioning whether traditional approaches were the right fit for his son. Jisoo responded to authenticity, to genuine connection, to the kind of natural warmth that couldn't be learned from textbooks or professional training. Perhaps what his son needed wasn't more therapy, but more of whatever healing magic Naomi seemed to possess. That evening, he made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of hovering in hallways and observing from doorways, he knocked on Jisoo's door and asked if he could join the origami lesson that had become their nightly routine. "Of course, Daddy," Jisoo said, and the easy acceptance in his voice made Daehyun's heart skip. It had been so long since his son had welcomed his presence without tension or fear. Naomi looked up from the paper she was folding, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes warm with understanding. "We're working on flowers tonight," she said, making space for him at the small table by the window. "Jisoo has been practicing all day." As Daehyun settled into the chair beside his son, his large hands clumsy with the delicate paper, he felt something shift in the atmosphere of the room. For the first time in months, they felt like a family again, not a broken father and his traumatized child, but simply three people sharing a quiet moment of creativity and connection. "Like this, Daddy," Jisoo said softly, his small hands guiding Daehyun's fingers through a particularly tricky fold. The role reversal, his son teaching him instead of the other way around, felt both humbling and healing. Naomi watched them work together, her presence a steady anchor that kept the moment feeling safe and natural. She offered gentle guidance when needed, celebrated small successes with genuine enthusiasm, and somehow managed to make Daehyun feel like his amateur attempts at paper folding were worthy of praise. As the evening wore on, and Jisoo's eyelids began to grow heavy, Daehyun found himself reluctant to leave. This room, with its soft lighting and gentle energy, felt more like home than anywhere else in his vast mansion. And the woman who had created this sanctuary for his son was beginning to feel essential in ways that had nothing to do with her official duties. When Naomi finally suggested that it was time for Jisoo to sleep, the boy looked up at both adults with an expression of contentment that Daehyun hadn't seen in months. "Will you both be here tomorrow?" Jisoo asked, his voice small but hopeful. "I'll be here," Naomi promised, tucking the covers around him with practiced care. Jisoo's eyes turned to his father, and Daehyun felt the weight of that trust, that hope, settle on his shoulders like a sacred responsibility. "I'll be here too," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. As they left Jisoo's room together, Daehyun caught Naomi's arm gently, stopping her in the hallway. She looked up at him with questioning eyes, and he found himself struggling to find words for the gratitude that threatened to overwhelm him. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual, for giving him back his smile. Naomi's expression softened, and she shook her head slightly. He never lost it, Mr. Seo. It was just hiding until he felt safe enough to let it show again. Her words hit him like a revelation, and as he watched her walk away toward her quarters, Daehyun realized that Naomi Carter had done more than heal his son. She had shown him that love wasn't about control or protection or providing solutions. Sometimes love was simply about creating space for healing to happen naturally, in its own time, in its own way. And for the first time since the night that had changed everything, Daehyun began to believe that they might actually find their way back to happiness. 3 weeks into Naomi's tenure at the Seo estate, the first real test of their newfound peace arrived in the form of a thunderstorm that rolled across Los Angeles with unusual intensity. The weather service had issued warnings about flash flooding and power outages, but nothing had prepared Daehyun for the way the storm would affect his son. The first crack of thunder sent Jisoo diving under his bed, his small body trembling with the kind of terror that no amount of rational explanation could touch. The sound was too similar to the breaking glass and splintering wood from the night of the break-in, too reminiscent of the chaos that had shattered his sense of safety. Dae-hyun found his son curled in the narrow space beneath his bed frame, his eyes wide with panic and his breathing shallow and rapid. All the progress they had made over the past weeks seemed to evaporate in an instant, leaving behind the frightened, broken child that Dae-hyun had feared might be permanent. "Jisoo, it's just thunder," he said gently, crouching down to peer under the bed. "You're safe. The house is secure. Nothing can hurt you here." But logic had no power over trauma, and Jisoo only pressed himself further into the shadows, his small hands covering his ears, as another rumble of thunder shook the windows. Dae-hyun felt the familiar helplessness rise in his chest, the crushing weight of being unable to protect his child from the demons that lived in his own mind. It was Naomi who found them there 20 minutes later, drawn by the sound of Dae-hyun's increasingly desperate attempts to coax his son out of hiding. She took in the scene with one quick glance, her expression shifting from concern to understanding to determination in the space of a heartbeat. "Mr. Seo," she said quietly, "may I try something?" Dae-hyun looked up at her, his own face tight with stress and frustration. "Nothing's working. He won't come out, won't listen to reason. It's like he's back to where we started." "Sometimes fear doesn't listen to reason," Naomi replied, settling onto the floor beside him, "but it might listen to something else." She lay down on her stomach, bringing herself to Jisoo's eye level beneath the bed. Instead of trying to coax him out, she simply made herself present in his space, her voice soft and steady as she began to speak. "Hey there, brave boy," she said, her tone carrying no urgency or demand. "That thunder is pretty loud, isn't it? It reminds me of the storms we used to get back home in Georgia. They would roll across the sky like freight trains, shaking the whole house." Jisoo's breathing was still rapid, but Dae-hyun noticed that he had stopped pressing his hands against his ears. He was listening. "My grandmother used to tell me that thunder was just the sky's way of clearing out all the bad energy," Naomi continued, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a storyteller. "She said every rumble was pushing away sadness and fear and hurt, making room for good things to grow." Another crack of thunder made Jisoo flinch, but he didn't retreat further into the shadows. His dark eyes were fixed on Naomi's face, finding anchor in her calm presence. "She taught me a song for stormy nights," Naomi said, and without any self-consciousness, she began to hum a gentle melody that seemed to wrap around them like a warm blanket. The tune was simple and soothing, with a rhythm that gradually slowed Jisoo's panicked breathing. Dae-hyun watched in amazement as his son slowly began to relax, his small body uncurling from its defensive position. Naomi's presence seemed to create a bubble of safety that even the storm couldn't penetrate, her voice and her calm energy more powerful than all the security systems and rational explanations in the world. "Would you like to come out and watch the storm with me?" Naomi asked when the song ended. "Sometimes things are less scary when we look at them together." Jisoo hesitated for a long moment, then slowly began to crawl out from under the bed. Dae-hyun reached for him instinctively, but Naomi caught his eye and shook her head slightly. She understood that this moment belonged to Jisoo, that he needed to make the choice to emerge on his own terms. When the boy finally stood beside them, his hair mussed and his pajamas wrinkled, Naomi held out her hand in invitation rather than demand. "Want to see something beautiful?" She led them to the large window that overlooked the estate's gardens, where the storm was putting on a spectacular display of nature's power. Lightning illuminated the sky in brilliant flashes, and rain drummed against the glass in rhythmic patterns that were almost musical. "Look," Naomi said, pointing to where the lightning reflected off the wet leaves of the trees. "See how the storm makes everything sparkle? It's like the whole world is covered in diamonds." Jisoo pressed close to the window, his fear gradually transforming into wonder, as Naomi helped him see the beauty in what had terrified him moments before. She pointed out the way the wind made the trees dance, how the lightning painted temporary masterpieces across the clouds, how the rain would make the flowers in their garden grow stronger and more beautiful. "The storm won't last forever," she said softly, her hand resting gently on Jisu's shoulder. But the good things it brings, the clean air, the fresh water for the plants, the way it washes everything clean, those things stay. Daehyun found himself mesmerized, not just by his son's transformation, but by the woman who had orchestrated it. Naomi possessed a kind of wisdom that couldn't be taught in schools or learned from books. She understood the language of fear and spoke fluently in the dialect of comfort, translating terror into wonder with nothing more than patience and love. As the storm gradually moved on, leaving behind the gentle patter of light rain and the fresh scent of washed air, Jisoo finally allowed himself to be tucked back into bed, but instead of the tense, fearful sleep that usually followed his episodes, he drifted off peacefully, his breathing deep and even. "How did you know?" Daehyun asked Naomi as they stood in the hallway outside Jisoo's room. "How did you know exactly what he needed?" Naomi was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I was scared of storms when I was little too," she said finally. "My grandmother could have told me they weren't dangerous, could have explained the science behind thunder and lightning, but instead, she helped me find the beauty in them. She taught me that fear and wonder could exist in the same space, and that sometimes the things that scare us most are also the things that can teach us to be brave." Her words resonated in Daehyun's chest, stirring something deep and long buried. He had spent months trying to eliminate his son's fears, to build walls high enough and strong enough to keep all threats at bay. But Naomi had shown him a different approach, not to eliminate the fear, but to transform it, to help Jisoo find his own strength within it. "You're remarkable," he said quietly, the words escaping before he could stop them. Naomi looked up at him with surprise, a soft blush coloring her cheeks. "I'm just doing what feels right." "That's what makes you remarkable," Daehyun replied, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. The moment stretched between them, charged with something that had nothing to do with the storm outside, and everything to do with a recognition, passing between two souls who had found something unexpected in each other. But before either could explore what that recognition might mean, the sound of Jisoo calling out broke the spell. "Miss Naomi, Daddy, are you still there?" They both moved toward his door, but Naomi paused, her hand on the doorframe. "Would you like to sit with him for a while?" she asked. "I think he might need to know you're close tonight." Daehyun nodded, grateful for her understanding, but as he settled into the chair beside his son's bed, he found himself hoping that Naomi would stay too, that her calming presence would remain to anchor them all through the remainder of the night. "Miss Naomi," Jisoo whispered as she turned to leave, "will you tell me more about your grandmother's stories tomorrow?" "Of course," she promised, her voice warm with affection. "I have lots of stories about brave children and beautiful storms." As she finally left them alone, Daehyun reached out to smooth his son's hair, marveling at how relaxed and peaceful Jisoo seemed. The boy who had been paralyzed with terror just hours before was now drifting toward sleep with a small smile on his lips, his trust in the world slowly being rebuilt one gentle moment at a time. "Daddy?" Jisoo murmured sleepily. "Yes, son?" "I like Miss Naomi. She makes the scary things not scary anymore." Daehyun's throat tightened with emotion. "She does, doesn't she? Do you think she'll stay with us for a long time?" The innocent question hit Daehyun like a physical blow, because he realized in that moment that the thought of Naomi leaving had become unthinkable. She wasn't just an employee anymore, wasn't just someone who worked in their house. She had become essential to their healing, to their happiness, to their hope for a future that looked brighter than their past. "I hope so," he whispered, and as Jisoo finally surrendered to sleep, Daehyun found himself making a silent promise that he would do whatever it took to ensure that hope became reality. Because losing Naomi Carter would mean losing the light she had brought back into their lives, and he wasn't sure any of them would survive that kind of darkness again. The call came at 3 in the morning, jarring Daehyun from the first peaceful sleep he'd enjoyed in months. Sangmin's voice was tight with urgency, carrying news that would shatter the fragile sanctuary they had built within the estate's walls. "Boss, we have a problem. Kim Tae-won is making moves. He's been asking questions about your family, about the house staff. Our sources say he's planning something." Dae-hyun was instantly alert, his mind shifting into the cold, calculating mode that had kept him alive in a world where weakness meant death. Kim Tae-won was a rival who had been testing boundaries for months, probing for vulnerabilities in Dae-hyun's organization. The fact that he was now targeting family meant the situation had escalated beyond business into something far more personal and dangerous. "What kind of questions?" Dae-hyun asked, already moving toward his secure office where he could speak freely. "About routines, schedules, who has access to the house. He's been particularly interested in the new staff member, the woman." Ice flooded Dae-hyun's veins. The thought of Naomi being targeted, being used as a weapon against him, unleashed a protective fury that surprised him with its intensity. She was innocent in all of this, a gentle soul who had stumbled into their world of shadows and violence without understanding the dangers that surrounded her. "Double the security detail," he ordered. "And I want eyes on Kim Tae-won 24/7. If he so much as breathes in the direction of my family, I want to know about it." "Already done, boss. But there's something else. We intercepted communications suggesting he might try to use the woman to get to you. He thinks she's a weakness." The irony wasn't lost on Dae-hyun. Kim Tae-won was right. Naomi had become a weakness, but not in the way his enemy imagined. She wasn't a liability because she was fragile or helpless. She was a vulnerability because she had become precious, because the thought of harm coming to her made him willing to burn the world down to keep her safe. "I need to tell her," Dae-hyun said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "She deserves to know what she's walked into." "Boss, with respect, maybe it would be better to just increase her protection without—" "No." Dae-hyun's voice cut through Sang-min's suggestion like a blade. "I won't lie to her. She's not just staff anymore, and she has a right to make an informed decision about her safety." The conversation with Naomi took place the next morning in his study, with sunlight streaming through tall windows and the distant sound of Jisoo's laughter drifting from the garden where he was playing under the watchful eyes of their security team. The normalcy of the scene made what Dae-hyun had to say feel even more surreal. Naomi sat across from his desk, her posture attentive but relaxed, clearly expecting a routine discussion about household matters or Jisoo's progress. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes, and her hair was pulled back in a style that was both professional and elegant. She looked beautiful, peaceful, completely unprepared for the darkness he was about to introduce into her world. "Naomi," he began, then stopped, struggling to find words that would convey the gravity of the situation without terrifying her. "There are things about my business, about my life, that you need to understand." Something in his tone must have alerted her to the seriousness of the conversation, because her expression shifted from casual attention to focused concern. "What kind of things?" "The kind that could put you in danger," he said bluntly, deciding that honesty, however harsh, was kinder than deception. "My organization operates outside the law. We have enemies, people who would use anyone close to me as a weapon against me." Naomi was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the same thoughtful consideration she brought to everything else. "Are you talking about the Korean Mafia?" she asked finally, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was asking. Dae-hyun felt a flicker of surprise at her directness. "You knew?" "I suspected," she admitted. "The level of security, the way certain visitors are treated, the fact that you conduct business at all hours and never seem to leave the house for a regular job. I'm not naive, Mr. Seo. I grew up in neighborhoods where you learn to recognize the signs of people who lived outside the law." Her calm acceptance of his reality was both relief and revelation. She wasn't shocked or horrified or judgmental. She was simply processing new information and adjusting her understanding accordingly. There's a man named Kim Tae-won who sees you as a potential weakness, Dae-hyun continued. He's been asking questions about you, about your routines, about your access to this house and to my family. Now he saw fear flicker in her eyes, but it wasn't fear for herself. It was fear for Jisoo, for the innocent child who had already suffered too much trauma. Is Jisoo in danger? Not directly, Dae-hyun assured her quickly. My son is protected by layers of security that would be nearly impossible to breach. But Kim Tae-won might try to use you to get to him, to get to me. Naomi stood and walked to the window, her movements controlled but tense, as she processed the implications of what he was telling her. When she turned back to face him, her expression was resolute in a way that reminded him she had survived challenges he could only imagine. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. He had expected her to quit, to pack her bags and flee from the danger he had brought into her life. Instead, she was asking how she could help, how she could be part of the solution rather than simply another problem to solve. "I need you to be careful," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "I need you to follow security protocols, to never go anywhere alone, to trust the people I assign to protect you." "And if I choose to leave?" she asked, though something in her tone suggested it wasn't really a question she was considering. "Then I'll make sure you're relocated safely, with enough money to start over anywhere you want," Dae-hyun replied without hesitation. "Your safety is more important than anything else." Naomi studied his face for a long moment, as if she could read the truth of his feelings in his expression. "What about Jisoo? What happens to him if I leave?" The question hit him like a physical blow, because they both knew the answer. Jisoo had formed an attachment to Naomi that went beyond simple affection. She had become his anchor, his source of safety and comfort, in a world that had proven capable of terrible things. Losing her would be another trauma, another abandonment that could undo all the healing they had worked so hard to achieve. "He would survive," Dae-hyun said quietly, "but he would be hurt. And I'm not sure how long it would take him to trust anyone else the way he trusts you." Naomi closed her eyes, and he could see the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. She was being asked to choose between her own safety and the well-being of a child she had come to love, between the smart choice and the right choice. When she opened her eyes again, they were bright with unshed tears but steady with determination. "I'm staying," she said simply. "Naomi, I'm staying," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "That little boy has been through enough. He doesn't need to lose someone else he cares about, because the world is full of dangerous people." Dae-hyun felt something crack open in his chest, a rush of gratitude and admiration, and something deeper that he wasn't ready to name. This woman who owed them nothing, who could walk away and build a safe life somewhere else, was choosing to stay and face danger because she loved his son. "There will be guards," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You won't be able to go anywhere without protection. Your freedom will be limited, your privacy compromised. I understand. And if things escalate, if Kim Tae-won makes a direct move, I might have to send you away whether you want to go or not. I understand that too." They stood there for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling between them like a bridge they had crossed together. Naomi was no longer just an employee who happened to be good with his son. She was someone who had chosen them, chosen to be part of their complicated, dangerous, beautiful family despite the risks. "Thank you," Dae-hyun said finally, the words inadequate for the depth of what he was feeling. "Don't thank me yet," Naomi replied with a small smile that didn't quite hide her fear. "Ask me again when this is all over, and we're all still in one piece." But even as she spoke, Dae-hyun could see the steel in her spine, the quiet courage that had carried her through whatever challenges had shaped her life before she came to them. Kim Tae-won thought Naomi was a weakness, but he was wrong. She wasn't a vulnerability. She was a strength they hadn't known they needed, a light that made them all braver and better than they had been before, and Dae-hyun would die before he let anyone extinguish that light. The attack came not with violence, but with silence. Kim Tae-won's strategy was more insidious than Dae-hyun had anticipated. Instead of a direct assault, he began a campaign of psychological warfare designed to slowly erode the peace they had built within the estate's walls. Phone calls in the middle of the night, with nothing but breathing on the other end. Flowers delivered to the house with notes that contained veiled threats. Cars that followed Naomi during her rare trips outside the estate, always staying just far enough away to avoid confrontation, but close enough to be noticed. The pressure was designed to break them slowly, to make them turn on each other, to force mistakes born of paranoia and fear. And for a while it seemed to be working. Jisoo began having nightmares again, his subconscious picking up on the tension that permeated the house despite everyone's efforts to maintain normalcy. The security presence had been increased to the point where armed guards were visible in every corridor, a constant reminder that danger lurked just beyond their walls. Naomi bore the stress with characteristic grace, but Dae-hyun could see the toll it was taking. She moved through her days with the same gentle efficiency, still spending time with Jisoo, still bringing light to every room she entered. But there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, and a tension in her shoulders that revealed the weight of constantly looking over her shoulder. It was on a particularly difficult evening, when Jisoo had awakened screaming from another nightmare and nothing seemed to calm him, that Dae-hyun finally reached his breaking point. He stood in the hallway outside his son's room, listening to Naomi's soft voice as she tried to soothe the boy's fears, and felt the familiar rage building in his chest. This was his fault. His choices, his enemies, his world of violence and shadows had infected the sanctuary they had built together. Jisoo was suffering because of him. Naomi was in danger because of him. The two people he cared about most in the world were paying the price for his sins. He was so lost in his self-recrimination that he almost missed the sound that changed everything. It was barely audible at first, a whisper so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind outside. But as Dae-hyun moved closer to Jisoo's door, the words became clearer, and what he heard made his breath catch in his throat. Naomi was praying. Not the formal, rehearsed prayers of organized religion, but the raw, desperate pleading of a heart that had nowhere else to turn. She knelt beside Jisoo's bed, her hands gently holding his small ones, tears streaming down her face as she poured out her soul to whatever divine force might be listening. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion, "please help him sleep tonight. Please help him feel safe. Let him know he is protected. He is loved, he is strong. Lift the weight from his little heart. Give him peace no one else has been able to give him." Dae-hyun leaned against the doorframe, his own eyes burning as he watched this woman, who owed them nothing, who could have walked away from their chaos and danger, begging God to heal his son. She brushed hair from Jisoo's forehead with infinite tenderness, her tears falling silently as she continued her desperate petition. "He's just a child," she continued, her voice barely audible. "He deserves rest. He deserves joy. Please, help him heal. Help us all heal." The sight of Jisoo's breathing gradually evening out, his small body relaxing under the gentle weight of Naomi's love and faith, broke something fundamental inside Dae-hyun. This was what he had been missing, what all his money and power and strategic thinking couldn't provide. Not protection from the world's dangers, but the kind of love that could transform fear into peace, darkness into light. He had hired bodyguards and doctors and therapists, had built walls and installed cameras and created fortress-like security, but he had never hired someone who would love his son enough to weep for him, to pray for him, to offer her own heart as a shield against his pain. Dae-hyun's legs gave out and he slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands, as years of suppressed emotion finally broke free. He wept for his son's lost innocence, for his own failures as a father, for the violence that had shaped his life and threatened to destroy everything good he had ever touched. But mostly, he wept for the woman kneeling beside his son's bed, whose love had proven stronger than all his fears. When Naomi finally emerged from Jisoo's room, she found Dae-hyun still sitting in the hallway, his face wet with tears he hadn't bothered to hide. She stopped short, clearly startled by the sight of this powerful, controlled man in such a vulnerable state. "Mr. CO?" she said softly, concern replacing surprise in her voice. "Are you all right?" He looked up at her, this woman who had saved his son, and, in doing so, had saved him too. "I heard you," he said simply. "I heard you praying for him." Naomi's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and she looked away. "I'm sorry if I overstepped. I know you might not share my beliefs, but I didn't know what else to do." "Don't apologize," Dae-hyun said, struggling to his feet. "Don't ever apologize for loving my son." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning that went far beyond their simple surface. Naomi looked up at him, her eyes wide with something that might have been hope or fear or recognition. "I do love him," she whispered. "I know I'm just the help. I know I don't have any right to feel this way, but I can't help it. He's such a good boy, and he's been hurt so much, and I just want him to be happy." "You're not just the help," Dae-hyun said, stepping closer to her. "You haven't been just the help for a long time. You're family, Naomi. You're the heart of this house, the light that guides us all." Tears spilled over her cheeks, and without thinking, Dae-hyun reached out to catch them with his thumb. The touch was gentle, reverent, full of a tenderness he hadn't known he possessed. "You saved my son," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But more than that, you saved me. You showed me what love really looks like, what it means to put someone else's well-being above your own safety, your own comfort, your own life." Naomi's breath hitched, and she leaned into his touch despite herself. "Dae-hyun." The sound of his name on her lips, spoken without titles or formality, sent electricity through his entire body. It was the first time she had called him by his given name, and it felt like a door opening between them, a wall finally crumbling under the weight of everything they had been holding back. "I love you," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. "I love your strength, your gentleness, your faith, your courage. I love the way you see beauty in broken things and refuse to give up on healing. I love you, and I need you to know that before anything else happens." Naomi's eyes widened, and for a moment he thought she might pull away, might remind him of all the reasons why this was impossible, why a man like him could never deserve a woman like her. Instead, she rose up on her toes and kissed him. It was soft and sweet and desperate all at once, a kiss that tasted of tears and hope, and the kind of love that could survive anything the world threw at it. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, their foreheads resting together as they tried to process what had just happened. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. "I've loved you for weeks, and I was so scared because I knew I shouldn't, knew it was impossible, but I couldn't help it." "Nothing about this is impossible," Dae-hyun said fiercely, his hands framing her face. "Nothing that feels this right could ever be wrong." They might have stayed there forever, lost in the wonder of finally acknowledging what had been building between them for weeks. But the sound of a small voice from behind them broke the spell. "Daddy, Miss Naomi, are you okay?" They turned to find Jisoo standing in his doorway, his hair tousled from sleep, and his eyes bright with curiosity rather than fear. For the first time in months, he looked like the confident, inquisitive child he had been before trauma stole his light. "We're perfect, son," Dae-hyun said, reaching out to include Jisoo in their embrace. "We're all perfect." And as the three of them stood together in the hallway, surrounded by love and hope and the promise of healing, Dae-hyun finally understood what Naomi had been praying for all along. Not just peace for his son, but wholeness for their family. Not just safety from external threats, but the courage to love each other completely, without reservation or fear. Kim Tae-won could threaten them, could try to tear them apart with violence and intimidation. But he would never succeed, because what they had built together was stronger than fear, stronger than danger, stronger than anything the world could throw at them. They had found their way home to each other, and nothing would ever tear them apart again. Years had passed since that night in the hallway, when three broken hearts finally found their way to wholeness. The SEO estate still stood like a fortress against the Los Angeles skyline, but the atmosphere within its walls had transformed completely. Where once silence and shadows had reigned, now laughter echoed through marble corridors and sunlight seemed to linger longer in every room. Jisoo, now 12 years old, raced through the garden with the boundless energy of a child who had never known fear. His nightmares were distant memories, replaced by dreams of adventure and possibility. He spoke in full sentences, asked endless questions about everything from astronomy to art history, and possessed the kind of confidence that came from knowing he was deeply, unconditionally loved. "Mum, Dad, come see what I built," he called, his voice carrying the easy joy of a boy who had never doubted his place in the world. Naomi looked up from the flower arrangement she was creating for their dining room table, her face glowing with the kind of happiness that came from a life lived in perfect alignment with her heart's deepest desires. She wore a simple white dress that complemented her radiant skin, and a wedding ring that caught the afternoon light as she moved. "What has our little architect created now?" she asked Daehyun, who was reviewing security reports at his desk, but immediately set them aside when his family called. They found Jisoo in the garden, standing proudly beside an elaborate fort he had constructed from fallen branches and garden stones. It was impressive in its complexity, complete with multiple rooms and what appeared to be a sophisticated defense system designed to keep out imaginary invaders. "It's for protecting the people you love," Jisoo explained seriously, his dark eyes bright with the intelligence that had always been his gift. "See, the walls are high enough to keep bad guys out, but there are windows so you can still see the beautiful things outside." Daehyun felt his throat tighten with emotion as he recognized the wisdom in his son's words. Jisoo had learned, through his own healing journey, the delicate balance between protection and openness, between safety and trust. He had built a fortress that could defend against threats while still allowing light to enter. "It's perfect," Naomi said, crouching down to examine the fort's intricate details. "Just like its creator." Jisoo beamed at the praise, then turned to his father with the kind of direct gaze that still sometimes took Daehyun by surprise. "Dad, do you think the bad man will ever come back?" Kim Tae-won had been neutralized years ago, his organization dismantled, and his threat eliminated through methods that Daehyun preferred not to discuss in front of his family. But Jisoo's question wasn't really about external enemies. It was about the deeper fear that sometimes lingered in the hearts of those who had once been broken. "No, son," Daehyun said, settling onto the grass beside them both. "But even if he did, we would be ready. We're stronger now, all of us together." "Because we love each other," Jisoo said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who had never doubted this fundamental truth. "Because we love each other," Naomi agreed, reaching out to smooth his hair with the same gentle touch she had used to calm his nightmares all those years ago. As the sun began to set over their garden, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the three of them sat together in comfortable silence. Jisoo leaned against his mother's shoulder, while Daehyun's arm encircled them both, creating a circle of protection and love that no external force could ever break. "Thank you," Daehyun whispered to Naomi, his lips brushing against her temple. "For what?" she asked, though her smile suggested she already knew the answer. "For saving us all," he replied, "for showing us that love is stronger than fear, that healing is possible, that broken things can become beautiful again." Naomi turned in his arms, her eyes bright with tears of joy rather than sorrow. "We saved each other," she corrected gently. "That's what families do." And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above them, three hearts that had once been separate and wounded beat in perfect harmony, proof that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin in the darkest places and grow into something that can light up the entire world. Thank you for staying until the end. Korean Mafia Lovers has many more incredible stories waiting for you. Subscribe now because your support helps us continue creating these emotional journeys that touch the heart.